All right, let's tie my Straggle Stone. This is a pattern I've had with Umpqua for a while, and this is going to be a golden stone version, but you can do it in a darker version for a salmon fly, or you can do it in a cobalt and black like my Magneto version for steelhead. It's kind of an attractor trout pattern as well. Lots of things you can do with this fly. So I took an inverted tungsten bead there, and I put some super glue on the shank and slid it forward upside down. And now that bead is directly opposite of the hook point. So it's a teardrop shaped bead. And when you glue it in place, you want that heavy part of the teardrop, the main body of the teardrop, opposite of the hook point. And that's a 3.5 millimeter inverting bead. You can play with whatever size you want. You can do these, with a 4 millimeter bead and a bunch of lead wire, it'll pack a lot of weight. So normally I do my hooks like that, set them up on some cork or foam while they dry, and then come back to the one that I started with, like this one right here. And by the time I've done that, it's dry and set and ready to go. The next thing I'm going to do, you can tie this pattern without any additional weight, but it is a pattern that looks really, really good if you have extra weight on there. So if you need a pattern with a ton of weight for some deep water or something like that, then it's a good one to be able to turn to, because you can pack it full of weight without making it look silly like you would with some other patterns. Okay, so all I did was I took some 20 thousandths of an inch thick lead wire, put some super glue on the shank there to hold that in place, and that way I don't have to cover it all in thread to bind it down. And now I'm going to take some 8/0 Rusty Dunn uni thread. You could use a little bit darker camel if you wanted, especially if you're going to tie a brown version of this. And that would be just fine. I'm going to put a little bit of thread on the back there. And now I have some sexy floss. This is tan. Amber would be good as well. And I've pre-cut the sexy floss into, 1.5 inch segments here. I find whenever I'm working with rubber legs, I used to hate working with them. And then I realized, you know what? Just trim them beforehand so they're not gangly and getting trapped under everything. And yeah, you might waste a little bit of material, but they're a lot easier to work with. So I'll back up and do that again for you. So I've tied it in on the far side of the hook. And I'm just gonna, I've bound it down, and then I'm pulling the other part of that leg to the near side, and I'm gonna trap it and put a couple of wraps down. And right now it's splayed pretty wide. I'm going to leave it that way. Yes, this is the tail, and golden stone tails, for one thing, aren't that long, but they're also not splayed that wide. But it's there for movement more than anything, and that'll work fine. But if you wanted to try and narrow those down, you could do it with some material that we're going to add here in a bit. Next thing I'm going to do is add some copper wire on here. So this is brassy size in a copper color. You could also do a brown. And then I have some mottled gold skinny skin here. Mottled brown would work well. You could do black or just plain brown for a darker version. And I've cut an angle on the top here. It's kind of like a spear point right now. There's a paper backing on this material, so you got to trim it. And then by putting that angle on the top, it's easier to pull that white paper backing off. So I'm just going to do that. And now you can see the paper backing's gone. And there's a shiny side and a dull side to this. Both surfaces kind of look shiny in this light that I have in here. So I'm going to guess if you want the shiny side up, when you finish the fly, that means you need to put it down as you tie it in. So I think that I have it right, where the matte side is facing up right now. I'm going to tie that down and wind back. And this is one of the easier mistakes you can make with this fly, is to leave a little gap here. So I'm going to just lift up and check and make sure that I've got thread all the way back to where those legs are tied in. Because sometimes if you don't go all the way back, then you have just a tiny little gap of thread in there. And it's not going to make it fish any poorer, but it just doesn't look very clean. Okay, now I have some gray olive micro straggle string from Hairline, and this works well. You can also use, sorry, not straggle string. Straggle strings from Semperfli. So yeah, you can use straggle string from Semperfli like this, or this is micro UV polar chenille from Hairline. My bad. Both materials work well. The polar chenille is a little bit wider, has a little bit longer fibers, and the straggle string is a little narrower and has a few more color options. You can do this, in a brown micro UV polar chenille for a darker stone. But this gray olive works well for golden stones like this. So I'm going to come forward probably about 2/3 of the way or a little bit more up the shank, and just put a couple whip finishes in because I'm going to use just a whip finish in because I'm going to use the rotary function here to wind this UV polar chenille. And I want to do touching turns. It doesn't matter if you build up a little bit of bulk here, so I'd rather have touching turns that maybe go over the top of each other just a little bit than have bare lead wire showing. And I know that one thing you're going to think, or I'm going to get asked about, is, well, if you're using an inverting bead that turns the fly over, why did you put the shellback on the top? So before you ask me that, there's an easy answer here. I've watched nymphs underwater, first off, when I've been snorkeling for my old job as a fisheries biologist, but I've also looked at flies drifting underwater, and they move a lot. They get tossed by current quite a bit, both the nymphs that are natural and the flies. So this fly isn't only drifting in one direction as it goes through the water, and the fish aren't only going to see one side of it. So by putting it up top, I haven't noticed any difference in the success of the pattern, and it's a lot easier to work with to put this on top than it is to put it on the bottom and have to deal with that hook point when you tie everything in. So I still put the shell back up on top, even though it's an inverting bead, and I can promise you, at least from my experience, it hasn't made much difference to the fish. They still like the pattern just as much. Okay, so to put that shell back on, I'm just pulling it forward, and I'm going to tie it down. And wrap this wire through it, and I'm kind of wiggling and waggling it back and forth. And you want to make sure you get your first wrap a little ways up onto the shank. You don't want it near the back because it can slip off the back of the fly and hit those rubber legs. So make it, you want to make your first turn under the fly. So that's why I tied the wire on the far side of the hook. And that way, by the time you get up and over the top, you're already a ways onto the material. Okay. Oops. Looks like I didn't have my vise tight enough here. Okay. So there's 3 wraps, 4, and I'm going to then tie it down where my thread's at. And just go ahead and spin that wire to break it off. Then I'll fold that shell back toward the rear of the fly. And I'm going to tie in another rubber leg here on the near side, and I just trap it down with my thumb and put a couple of loose wraps on it, and then you can just bind it back to front and front to back. And that is in place the way I want it. And then I just turn it over in my vise and do the same thing on the other side. And I can make sure that as I'm doing this on the far side there that I hold the rubber leg in place so that it goes down in the exact spot I want it, at the angle I want it. And now those are nice and splayed out to the side in the configuration I want. And then I'm just going to tie that straggle string back in place. There we go. And then I'll fold those legs back, do a quick whip finish right there so that that thread's out of the way while I use the rotary function. And then do the same thing. I'm going to build a body, and I'm actually going to go back to the front to begin with to get those rubber legs out of the way with that material, and then I can go back. Now, if you've ever looked at stoneflies, the abdomen is as thick or thicker than the thorax. So technically I've probably built up a taper that's not all that natural there, but it works well to help shape those rubber legs the way you want. And some stoneflies still have a thorax that's a little bit thicker. So I've run with that, and it works well, at least on the water. Okay, tied that polar chenille down. Now I'm going to pull the shell back over. And one of the things that will likely happen, that almost always happens, is some of those fibers are going to get trapped down by the thread. Actually, it came out all right. But one thing I want to do here is make sure that I fold this back and tie it down again. And if you want to get fancy, you can do that and then either put some dubbing on here for one thing, but also you can trim this shell back into a little wing bud. So I can come here and actually make a little notch at the back if I want, and now I've got sort of a quote-unquote natural-looking wing bud from a golden stone. I don't think that matters a lot to the trout, but it looks kind of cool. So you could also just clip it off flush, but you do want to fold it back, because if you don't fold it back and put a couple of thread wraps over it, that can slip out, and that's one misstep you can make towards the durability of this fly. All right, I've put some super glue on the thread, and I'm going to make a couple wraps, and then just a quick 3-turn whip finish. And that's pretty much it. The only thing I'm going to come in and do is trim out a few of those wayward fibers from the micro polar chenille that have gotten trapped, just to clean the fly up a little bit. But that is the finished straggle stone. One last step there actually is to just even up those legs and make them the length that you want as well if they're a little bit long. But remember that you can't add rubber back on if you've trimmed it off. So start with trimming just a little bit and at a time, and then you can make them the length you want. I like to leave them longer than natural golden stones, just for some extra movement. But if you want, you can trim them down to more anatomical correctness. But there's the finished straggle stone, a good golden stone variation. And it's a great pattern as a stonefly imitative nymph, but also it's got enough flashiness to it that it makes a good attractor nymph. They'll definitely pick this out of the drift from the rest of what's going by, so it'll catch some attention and catch some fish for you.